happy to be able to be here tonight, even though I'm really sorry that you guys are here on a Friday night. So I feel that.
Speak up, Kathy.
Oh, okay. You can't hear me back there?
Well, you have to kind of project.
Project. Okay. I will try to project in an arc to get over it because I'm a little bit vertically limited. Please let me know if you can't hear me. The purpose of tonight is to really talk about something that's very basic, but also something that comes into play in a lot of liability claims. And you guys are all on the front lines and working with patients. And patients call, and you're in the position of having to identify what the need is and route those calls accordingly. So, let me see if I can... do you need to...
She has a jump drive that's plugged in.
Yeah. Yes, on the other side. You first. Okay, no problem. No, it's not recognizing it. Well, we do have a slide presentation, but apparently I can't get it to go. So I'm going to grab my handout and we'll go through it by that, because I don't want to take up too much of your time. The goal is that we can go through the basic information pretty quickly, but what I really want you to do is take advantage of having a risk management consultant here to answer questions for you and also to get you to talk to one another about what you do. Now, Deanna was kind enough to provide me with a copy of the kind of telephone triage policy and procedure for medication refills. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about tonight. But I also want to talk about what triage means versus handling phone calls, because there is a distinct difference, and it's important, as we've discovered through claims management, to be able to have a shared understanding of that and a consistent understanding of that. So, I also have a couple of other Starbucks cards, even though it looks like you guys are going to be caffeinated well over the next week anyway, and we'll pop in some questions for you to answer. First, we're going to be talking about what triage is and what triage isn't. Because triage is a term that gets bandied about whenever you have somebody answering a phone call. And in fact, there is a distinct difference. Telephone call handling means identifying yourself, identifying who's calling, identifying what it is they're seeking from you. Triage really involves identifying, collecting information, assessing that information, making recommendations about that, usually of a clinical nature. So there's telephone handling and routing, which involves collecting information, routing, and transmitting information. And then there's triage, which means that you're applying clinical knowledge to the information that you're receiving, making a clinical judgment, and then acting upon that. And the reason that this is becoming more and more important is that now that practices are on electronic records, sometimes we're finding that there is a disconnect between the old ways of communicating, confirming, and documenting, and how things are happening now. So, I wish I did. I'm sorry I'm dependent on this thing, because I have to wear my reading glasses in front of everybody. You want me to see if I can publish it? If you could, that'd be great. So, now that my age is showing in front of you all, I think that primarily what I want to do is pop straight on down to slide number 6. Because the key to all of this is consistency. Yes, yay! Not only can't you make beautiful cards, but you can solve my technical problem. Okay. Now, we've already gone over the collecting, interviewing, assessing, and this becomes particularly difficult in a situation like yours, where in order to meet the needs of your patient, you've got a broad spectrum of training and certification. So that I can have a good understanding of where all you are at, how many of you are RNs? Okay. How many of you are LPNs? Okay. How many of you are healthcare assistants that are registered with the state?
All of them. That would be you all.
In addition to that, how many of you have gone through a certified medical assistant education program? Okay, great. Right now in the state of Washington, there is a significant, well, it's been for a couple of decades, lack of acknowledgement of the type of training and work that you guys do. In fact, until a law was passed in the past year, medical assistants were not recognized as anything with regard to the Department of Health. And now they're in the process of engaging in some rulemaking so that your education and your experience is going to be acknowledged, and you guys are going to be able to be licensed healthcare providers, like nurses, like LPNs. In the meanwhile, the difference between taking a telephone call and engaging in telephone triage is pretty significant. Let me give you an example of how that played out in a claim really recently. And it involves an EHR. So when you hear some of the details, you guys are going to recognize a lot of issues. But a patient who had been a long-time patient with this practice, primary care provider, also had a history of arthritis for which she sought specialty care with a rheumatologist periodically. And she called her primary care provider's office because she was experiencing some pretty distressing and painful symptoms. So the physician did make the recommendation that she needed to get an appointment as soon as possible with the rheumatologist so that they can work it up and make sure that there wasn't any material advancement in her disease and that required change. But as a courtesy, said, you know, we'll go ahead and refill the prescription we know that you've had before. Now, they were on an EHR and had been on an EHR for quite some time, but had gone through an update in the software. The update was significant enough that there was actually a data conversion required in order to go live with the updated software. The result of that was that the refill frequency, or the dose and frequency, ended up being changed. And so this prescription that the patient had had in the past that was to be taken 4 times a week got converted into 4 times a day. Yeah, it was. So that was the first thing. Why didn't anybody notice? Well, the physician was operating under the mindset that he could have a standing order about refills. And the individual that he delegated that task to wasn't a licensed healthcare provider, and unfortunately in this case also did not have knowledge about this particular prescription and what the therapeutic doses were. So this individual then transmitted under the protocol this prescription to the pharmacy. Why the pharmacist never questioned it is still another mystery. But it was filled. The patient followed the direction on the bottle 4 times a day, and the next day called back the doctor's office and gave symptoms about what she was experiencing. That went through from the front desk to the physician's assistant, not a PAC, but the individual who assists the physician. And she made a recommendation to the provider based on what she thought was happening with the patient. So the patient was told not to worry, wait a couple days, ended up in the hospital for 12 days, had some pretty significant illness as a result of that. She did recover in the long run, but when a analysis was done of everything that occurred there, there was a breakdown in telephone call handling. There was somebody who was fulfilling a prescription refill protocol who hadn't had the clinical knowledge to be able to identify when a treatment was outside of a safe or therapeutic range. The pharmacy is still a different issue, but the key is here that we need to be able to identify between what should have been a telephone handling situation where information was collected, conveyed, the licensed healthcare provider made the decision, specified and approved the prescription that actually got sent. So there were a lot of missed opportunities here. So what we're going to do is talk about how at Sound Family you guys can identify which calls are triaging calls and which calls are phone handling. And I am prepared, because I know this isn't going to be a popular thing, and I don't think it's a right thing, but it is a Washington thing for the moment, and that is a lot of you RMAs, and you've got a lot of experience, you've got a lot of training, you probably know your patients better than some of the other healthcare providers because of the amount of time you spend greeting them, talking with them, listening to their symptoms as you are rooming them and taking their vitals. You've got a lot of true experience that brings them here. However, when it comes to a liability claim, a plaintiff's attorney is going to say, well, it doesn't matter, what their experience is or what they know. In Washington, they can't be making decisions like this. The way to protect yourselves and the way to protect the patients and the way to manage this until the rulemaking that implements the laws that recognize you is to be able to identify the call versus the triage, and then to be able to document consistently how you're conveying the information so that the healthcare provider is demonstrated to have made the judgment, the decision, the order that you then carry out. So I decided to look up triage in the medical dictionary, and what it really says is that triaging is about sorting patients according to the urgency of their need for care. And the sorting process really means making some clinical judgments about the information that you're getting. Now, I think that's essential, and I don't think that that alone turns your initial phone call into a triage call. But if you're starting to engage in clinical decision making that falls under the purview of nursing, or if you start having questions, then you need to be able to know where to up it to somebody who has the legal authority to make that clinical decision. So, the purpose for initial telephone call handling for the time being is to be able to identify the high-level purpose. Are they calling in with symptoms, or are they calling in about an administrative task? So, for instance, are they just calling in for a routine